Let me introduce uh, let me introduce myself. My name is Vincent Smith, and I'm president of Forge Audubon Society. And I want to welcome everybody here to our presentation. First things first, before we get into the presentation, I was going to ask that everybody who is attending the presentation to please put yourself on mute, and also could you turn off your video? We actually want to save all the bandwidth for our presenters here. And the second thing is we are going to have some questions at the end of the program, and there is a chat down below. So if along the way you have any questions that you would like to ask to our presenters, please do so. And also a little bit of a reminder that this is going to be recorded. So we are going to be recording the presentation. If you know of anybody who missed the presentation and they wanted to come to it, you can mention it, that it's recorded and on our website. So I want to first, thank everybody for coming out. I'm really excited about this presentation. For those who don't know the history of this presentation, we started to do Christmas bird counts back in the mid-'80s. And we also started to do spring bird counts. And because we have been conducting these bird censuses for that many years, we have this incredible amount of data. And the beauty of having all this wonderful data is that through the data, we can then track many trends that might be taking place within our local birding community. And that's part of the gist of what the origins of this presentation are about. We are really happy to have Ty Sharrow and Kelly Johnson here today, who when they were in college offered to volunteer to help us crunch this data. And with the help of Paul Bernhardt from Villanova University, they have been able to take some of this massive amount of data and crunch it down to see what particular trends might be taking place within our avian community, what bird species are going up and what bird species might be going down. And I know just off the top of my head, when I first started birding for Forge Audubon Society, which was in the year 2000, actually probably 1998, at that particular time, you would not find pileated woodpeckers except at one location, and now they are scattered throughout many of our count circles at this point. So it's kind of the way in which we can get that picture as to what's going on in the avian community. So I'm really happy to have Kelly and Ty here today. Kelly has a Bachelor of Science in Ecology from Westchester University, and presently is working at Arc Wild, which is a native plant and restoration company. And then we have Ty Sharrow, who has a BS in wildlife biology from Keystone College, as well as is presently going for his master's in biology at Arkansas State University. And I'm just really glad to have both of them here today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kelly. And reminder, if you have any questions at the end of the program, you can put your questions into the chat, and then we'll come back on and see if we can bounce those questions off of Kelly and Todd. So with that, Kelly, I'd like to turn it over to you, and I'll let you start the presentation.
All right. Thank you, Vince. Ty and I are excited to be here. We're excited to present about what we've been working on for about 2 years now. So the title of our presentation is called Avian Population Trends from 1992 to 2019. We've been working with the Forge Audubon Society, like Vince mentioned. And so since he already took care of our introductions, we're just going to move right on. So just a brief outline of what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about what exactly the CBC and SBC are, just a brief overview. We did a literature review just to see what else was being discovered about avian population trends in our area and countrywide. And then Ty's going to talk about the statistical methods and the limitations of our study at the level that it was conducted. And then I'll come in and talk about some trends that we found And then we're going to talk about the factors possibly influencing those trends. And lastly, finish up by talking about how we can help. So the history of the Christmas bird count and the Springbird count. The history of the Christmas bird count goes back to 1900, and it's been managed by the Audubon Society since 1905. It's actually the longest running citizen science initiative in the United States. It occurs all over the world, actually. There's over 2,000 count circles around the world, so it's pretty cool. This data is held by National Audubon Society and the local chapters, and it's used for research projects like this that Ty and I have conducted, as well as hundreds of other research projects. And so because the data goes back so far, that's one of the things that makes it so cool, and makes it really ideally suited for long-term and large-scale analysis. So many of you may be already familiar with the count protocol because you may be volunteers yourselves that have helped us get this data, and for that we're very grateful. So these volunteer-based surveys take place within one 24-hour period. Because we do a CBC and an SBC, that means that this happens twice a year, once in the spring and once in December. So these circles is the area, that's how we measure the area of what the study area, and they are 15 miles in diameter. And so the count circle stays the same for the spring and the winter. So thank you to volunteers. You are what comprise the parties. Parties are made up of birders, and they cover sections. And so the cool thing about party hours, which is the metric that we use to kind of standardize our data to make sure we were getting an accurate assessment of the yearly trends. Party hours, they are the total number of hours spent birding by the volunteers. And the trend with party hours, ideally you want as many as possible, because as party hours increase, you have increased confidence that you have most aptly, accurately recorded a section's bird species and bird counts. You can never know for sure what you've recorded, like its true accurate measurement, but with higher party hours comes an increased confidence that we've seen what there is to see. So the John James Audubon Center is located right between 11 and 10 on this map here. This map was made by Macy Turner, who did an internship for the Valley Forge Audubon Society. And she created this map to illustrate exactly where the sections were that are being covered, and they're in Montgomery, Chester, and Delaware counties. And it's not the entire county in each count circle. So the count circle is just pieces of Montco, Chesco, and Delco. So we recorded data consistently in all 11 sections for the CBC, but it got a little tricky when the SBC coverage varied annually. So we had to take that into account and use some independent variables there. So about the count circle area in general, it's historically, it was eastern deciduous forest, and some still remains, but it was mostly leveled with European settlement. And the primary reason it was done is for agriculture. And so that's what the second historical legacy was of this area. And then over time, forest regeneration has occurred. Some lands have been preserved and others have been developed into suburban housing outside of Philadelphia. So we have seen some regeneration over time, but it's definitely not as forested as it was pre-settlement by Europeans. And so one of the papers that we looked at for our literature review was a really groundbreaking study that came out in 2019. In 2019, Rosenberg et al. Published Decline of the North American Avifauna. And this was really, really groundbreaking because it was the first time a lot of people saw birds in the spotlight of like the public eye. And whether or not you're already familiar with this paper, it's a great thing to know. Their major finding was that there's a net 3 billion bird loss between 1970 and 2017, which is pretty darn devastating. It was mostly concentrated in like migratory species and aerial insectivores. The grassland bird species have also lost huge proportions of their numbers over those 50 years, but the most relevant to our study area is migratory and eastern forest. And those account for like 17.4% or 166.7 million birds just for the eastern forest. So this was part of our literature review, and the reason that authors cited as like causing these declines was habitat loss, degradation, and also pesticide use. So that's what they think is driving some of this change. And though that chart was really a lot of information to look at, this is a little bit easier. It just highlights another graphic from the 3 billion birds lost paper, concentrated in land birds, water birds, but there's also an increase in waterfowl, things like ducks and loons. And yeah, so that is one of the major trends that they found in their study since the 70s. I'm like, why are we studying birds in the first place? We're studying birds because they are excellent indicators of the ecological health of a location. So birds are bioindicators, and bioindicator means that because of a trickle up of the pesticides, herbicides, contaminants, and all those sorts of things, heavy metals, birds reflect, their health reflects a lot about an ecosystem that you can't just see like offhand looking. So looking at bird populations is supremely important because it tells you more than what you would just know otherwise on a surface level examination. On top of that, birds are extremely charismatic. They're accessible to a lot of people because of how many niches they encounter or like that they take part in and inhabit. So their widespread nature makes them accessible to people and just very fascinating to study and part of people's lives. So it's a good kind of flagship group for conservation. And so Ty is going to talk about statistical methodology of how we conducted our analysis.
Yes, so we performed an analysis of variance, which is also known as an ANOVA. And this is a statistical test that is used to determine if there is a significant change in frequencies considering independent variables. So for our analysis, the dependent variable that we used was the count of birds per species. And then our independent variables were year and party hour for the Christmas bird count, then year, party hours, and sections covered for the Springbird count. We included year as an independent variable to compare change over time, and party hours to consider the total survey effort that was put into it. And for the Springbird count, we included sections because unlike the Christmas bird count, the Christmas bird count had all 11 sections of the count circle covered, while the Springbird count that varied by year. 9 sections were covered in 1995, 10 sections were covered in 1996 through 98 and in 2019, and then all 11 sections were covered in 1999 through 2018. And that's really important to consider in this analysis because if a section was not covered, all those birds within that section were not included in the count totals. So after we performed this analysis, we evaluated the results based on their significance, looking at their p-value if it was less than 0.05. And we also looked at the adjusted R-square value. Now this adjusted R-square value, that just explains the proportion of variance in the count that can be explained by the independent variables used within the test. So if we looked at a deeper dive of the results and we can see that the number of party hours and or the number of sections, if that had a significant impact on the counts of birds, but not the year, that can be surmised that the bird counts cannot be attributed to a yearly change, but just dependent on how much effort was put into surveying. So here's a table of all 114 species that we analyzed. 48 of those species, we analyzed them both in the Springbird count and the Christmas bird count. Those are the ones that have a white background. And we also have 42 species that were analyzed just during the Springbird count. Those are in that orange rusty color. And we have 24 species that were analyzed just in the Christmas bird count in blue. We could not analyze every single species that was counted during the count, and we had to exclude 95 species. Some of these species were eruptive species like pine siskins and evening grosbeaks and pine grosbeaks. These are species that come down in the winter. Sometimes they're quite common. Other years they are totally absent. So that would kind of muddy the numbers and try to not really produce a clear result. Most of the species that we excluded, though, were low occurrence species, such as black-billed cuckoo, magnolia warbler, and American widgeon. And these are just species that were not counted frequently enough during the surveys to perform a statistical analysis on. Before we get into some of the results of these analyses, I just wanted to highlight some of the limitations that we experienced. So concerning methodological limitations, all surveys are inherently imperfect. Even though if all sections were covered, there were still birds that were not seen by surveyors and therefore not recorded. So the count totals are not the exact number of birds that were in the circle, just the ones that were detected and recorded. We are also using a low sample size, though the surveys span many years. The Christmas bird count and the spring bird count each only happen one day out of the entire year. So we are only seeing a small snapshot into the total yearly change in bird populations. And also birds are not in a fixed location. A lot of these birds are migrant species, so they are traveling outside of the count circle and their populations may be impacted by variables that are outside of our region. Some statistical limitations. We performed a relatively basic statistical analysis. We could have included a lot more variables, such as weather and land use, but that would have complicated our models and would have produced not as clear of results. Looking at the total effort that was put into these surveys, this is a graph of the Christmas bird count and the spring bird counts. You can see that the total party hours that were attributed to these surveys did vary quite a bit. The Christmas bird count was a low of 61 hours and to a high of 209 hours. So that was really important that we considered that during our analysis because that is quite a different change. Looking at some of the weather over the surveys, at the top, that is a graph of the average daily temperatures of when the Christmas bird count and the spring bird counts were recorded. And you can see there aren't really any outlying numbers, no days where it was super hot or super cold that might have influenced the bird behaviors. And we originally did include weather variables in our analysis, but we found that they really didn't have an influence on the number of birds recorded. So we removed that from our analysis. And that is similar to what other studies have found, that weather conditions really only have marginal effects on bird behavior and detectability. Also, such as songbirds may be negatively correlated with wind speed, while hawks are positively correlated. So even if we do add a weather variable, for some species it might be beneficial, while others it might be negative. Okay. This is a table of all of the species that we analyzed in the Springbird count, all 93 of them. And you can see the ones that had a positive population trend are highlighted in green. There were 22 species there, and then there were 5 species that had a negative population trend. And here are the species that we included in the Christmas bird count analysis. There were 73 of those, and they had less species that had a positive trend, only 17, and quite a bit more that had a negative trend, 13 species in total. Now we'll get into some of the species-specific results of our analyses. It is very evident of the return of the bald eagle and the peregrine falcon in our count circle. The first bald eagle that was recorded during a Springbird count was in 2006, and there were actually 2 of them, so that might have been a recently established nesting pair within the area that has returned. And then the first peregrine falcon was recorded during a Springbird count in 2014. And you can see that both species have stuck around and have increased in numbers since they were first recorded. Looking at the American kestrel, which is one of the species that I'm studying for my master's research right now, they had a significant decline during the Christmas bird count, which you can see in the graph there. And during the Springbird count, we did not find a significant population change, but the decrease during the Christmas bird count, that is something that is being seen all across their range in North America. There are widespread declines, and the reasons for these declines are not completely understood. Some people believe it might be because of pesticide exposure. Some think it might be because of limited nesting sites and competition with European starlings, but they are experiencing widespread declines. And on the bottom, that is sharp-shinned hawks. They experienced declines during the Christmas bird count, but they did not have a population change during the Springbird count. Cooper's hawks, they increased both during the Springbird count and the Christmas bird count, and that is indicating that they likely had a clear, definite population increase. And with the sharp-shins and the Cooper's hawk, one reason that is proposed for the decline of the sharp-shinned hawk is that there is increased competition with Cooper's hawks. And that would make sense looking at our data here, considering that sharp-shinned hawks look like they're declining while Cooper's hawks are increasing. Looking at vultures, the top graph, that is both black and turkey vultures included together. Both species increased significantly during both the Christmas bird count and the Springbird counts. And that aligns with what is being seen across North America, that vultures are increasing everywhere. And I wanted to specifically look at the black vulture during the Springbird count. As you can see, prior to 2005, they were pretty low occurrence species, about less than 20 per year. And then following 2005, they started to take a really large increase after that. And that supports that they are increasing their range northward and are becoming more common in the Northeast. Owls that we analyzed, the eastern screech owl and the great horned owl, they both had significant population declines during the Christmas bird count. They did not have a significant change during the Springbird count though, but that's not entirely surprising because they are more detectable during the Christmas bird count. So the Christmas bird count probably more accurately reflects their true population change. And that's because they are more detectable during Christmas bird counts. That's when they are hooting more, they are trying to find a mate and establish some territory. And so it appears that they are decreasing in the count circle.
So we're going to talk about edge species now. Edge species are species that prefer sort of fragmented habitat that thrive on the border of forest and grassland or prairie. They inhabit hedgerows and other shrubby areas. So the edge species are doing pretty well, actually. So one of the birds that we looked at was the gray catbird. And the gray catbird had one of the most significant increases of all bird species that we examined. Roughly an increase, the slope is 18.4 per year. So that's pretty significant. And we think that this might be because of habitat fragmentation, which is not necessarily a good thing. So though it may look like a species is doing well, and we're happy that a bird species is doing well, it's not necessarily a good indicator of habitat health. Another species that inhabits the edge and exhibits this sort of negative trend is brown-headed cowbird, which is a parasitic species. So it will lay its eggs in nests other than its own species, such as warblers and thrushes, which are of concern, per the 3 Billion Birds Lost paper in 2019. So the increase of these two species is maybe not necessarily a good thing, but it is indicative of larger trends. The Carolina wren is increasing pretty well. It's also an edge species, 7.5 is the slope a year. So it's very interesting to see what kinds of increases and decreases we're having. So a decrease for an edge species that we've examined is the northern mockingbird. And it's really interesting to me that something that can inhabit the same environment roughly as a catbird is declining. So there's something else in there going on, but I also tend to think that northern mockingbirds inhabit more mature kind of shrubbier habitat, but that's just me. House wrens are on the increase in the SBC, that is, roughly 5.29 a year. So they're doing very well. They have adapted to human inhabitation of areas very well. A surprise was the ruby-throated hummingbird. Our analysis indicated that it's doing fairly well and increasing. This could be due to observer differences, ability to identify, but overall it looks like they're doing well. The winter wren is a very cheerful winter visitor that we have in the CBC, and it looks like it's also increasing. So there could be some eruptive behavior there, or it could just actually be increasing, which is nice to see. And so Ty's going to talk about forest species next.
Yeah, so the forest species that had significant change were the orchard oriole, warbling vireo, cedar waxwing, and blue-gray gnatcatcher. They all had positive trends. And something interestingly you can see here with the blue-gray gnatcatcher, they had a peak in 2015, and then the following 4 years, it appears that they're possibly starting to trend downward. And that's something that can be seen with the 3 other species as well, maybe not quite to the same degree, but the last 4 or 5 years, they appear to be declining a little bit. The reasons for that is unknown. It could be habitat composition. Maybe there's less forest in the circle. Maybe the forests are maturing at a different age. That could be changing the habitat requirements for these species, making it less habitable for them. But they are increasing, so that's a good thing. And looking at woodpeckers, so the top graph, that is a grouping of all the woodpecker species and white-breasted nuthatches. And they increased significantly during the CBCs and the Springbird counts. Now I said all woodpeckers, that is excluding the northern flicker. And that's an interesting exclusion though, because they did not have a significant increase. However, all the other woodpeckers did. And a reason for this might be related to the feeding habits. Northern flickers are a woodpecker, but they usually feed on the ground, on ground insects, while the other woodpeckers do typical woodpecker behaviors. pecking on trees, looking for insects and such. So it might be this change in population trend might be due to the trees that the woodpeckers are feeding on. And the possible change might be the invasion of the emerald ash borer. And that is a species of invasive insect that really consumes and completely decimates ash trees, which I'm sure many of you have noticed and heard about. And though this is really negative for the ash trees, it might be a positive for woodpeckers because they are known to consume the larvae of emerald ash borers, and the increase in dead trees that will provide them more opportunities to nest and could possibly increase their breeding ability as well. Now, the emerald ash borer was first detected within the count circle in Montgomery County in 2013. You can see that here, that is approaching the peak of the woodpecker populations. And the same thing with the other forest species I mentioned, that following that, the last maybe 4 or 5 years of the count, they've started to decline. So if it's possible that the emerald ash borer is due to this increase, we would think that this increasing trend would continue within the past previous years as there are still dead ash trees in the area that they could inhabit. So that relationship is unknown, but that is a possible explanation for this, their trend.
So I'm going to talk a bit about songbirds and what we noticed in our research as compared to the Rosenberg 2019 paper. So we found that there were no trends in warblers overall. This was very shocking to me, and Ty as well, because we've been, literature review in our research. Ahead of time, it was a clear trend, but in our count circle, it doesn't appear to be the case, or the model needs, or there's another factor interfering with the model. But there are things like rose-breasted grosbeaks, common grackles, blue-winged warblers, and meadowlarks, the 4 that are represented on graphs here. They are decreasing pretty heavily. Unfortunately, the rose-breasted grosbeaks have come down from highs of 18 to a low of 1 or none. And that's a pretty clear linear trend that you can see there. And so the eastern meadowlark as well, also heading downhill a bit. We would usually see somewhere in the middle here, but it's down to just a few. And again, this is the spring breeding or the Springbird count. So this is how many breeding pairs we've observed, or breeding birds or pairs. So that's concerning for those 2 species. The common grackle is a little different. It's eruptive, yes, because they flock up in winter, but however, the nature of them as a breeding bird species, it makes it more reliable to do in the spring. And here we are seeing a bit of a decline. So from highs of 500 in the early years and continuing until like 2004, down to about 180 in 2019. So clearly there's a trend, and it's not necessarily a good one. However, when we're looking at the songbirds, it's important to know that when there is no trend, even if they're not increasing, maybe that's enough of a trend to be positive, positive thinking at least. So we didn't notice any trends. They weren't indicated to be changing or declining for savanna sparrows, fox sparrows, northern cardinals in the SBC, and dark-eyed juncos, indigo buntings, and even slightly for the song sparrows, they seem to be, if just only a little bit, increasing in the count circle. And to take this to identify like maybe the habitat type that we're talking about is primarily the count circle now. It's a mixture of the eastern deciduous forest, but there's also a large expanse of open fields in Valley Forge Park, which is located in the count circle. And so that could play a factor in the sparrow populations. Aerial insectivores were very hard hit in the Rosenberg et al. 2019 paper. That, however, was not the case. That's not what we found. And I mean, Ty and I found that strange, but the numbers don't lie. So we went with it and are happy to report that it looks like aerial insectivores in this area, just this area, are on the increase. So we looked at swallows, but also flycatchers, peewees, birds like that. And so aerial insectivores, before I talk more about them, they're birds that catch insects in the air as their main food source. And they're different from birds that eat insects just in their breeding season, because these birds eat insects year round, which is why we only studied the CBC for them, because they're not present in the winter because their food source is not here either. So they're migratory. So we have the willow flycatcher increasing, the eastern wood pewee increasing, great crested flycatcher as well. And again, this could be due to human interaction. So like we may be more able to identify willow flycatchers over, like, the people making up the spring bird counts do play a role in how we are able to interpret the data. So maybe people got better over time at identifying willow flycatchers or something like that. But it does look like there's a trend for sure. Water birds. So this would include the great blue heron, ducks. For example, I just did the hooded merganser and the common merganser. So the great blue heron, similar to the bald eagle and the peregrine falcon, I think it had some trouble with the DDT that caused the thinning of the eggshells, which is what contributed in the first place to the decline of the bald eagle and peregrine falcons in our area and around the world, was the buildup of DDT. And so that affected their nesting success, but it looks like after quite a few years of limited nesting success, the great blue herons in our area are doing well, and they've definitely expanded their population a couple times over, which is very hopeful. And I'm glad to see that our model very accurately reflected their population with an R-squared correlation of 80%. So that's a positive trend that I like to see. For the CBC, the hooded merganser and the common merganser, they both experienced increases. This could largely be due to conservation done by hunters. Duck hunters have put a lot of money into the habitat enrichment and protection of wetlands for their hunting purposes, but it also does support conservation. So that's a key part to mention. And this does correlate and confirm with Rosenberg et al., because the increase that they saw there was 56%. And we are also seeing an increase in water birds as well. So the only thing with the water birds, waterfowl like wood ducks, black ducks, buffleheads, golden eyes, and pied-billed grebes, also coots, American coots, they don't have any significant trends, but I guess we can be thankful that they're not downward trends. So that's something to note as well. This is an interesting bit of research that Ty and I found, the non-native native bird debate. So similar to the results of that paper that we've looked at for our literature review, some non-native bird species in that were shown to be declining. So in our case, with our study in our area, the house finches are definitely declining. This could be due to some disease interaction. They've been suffering from conjunctivitis, which is a disease mostly affecting house finches, to my knowledge. And so they're experiencing a very steep decline in like -15 per year. The highs of like 750 have no longer been occurring, and it's more like 200 when we observe them in the CBC. These are native to the United States, but they are from Arizona and were introduced to the Northeast. So think of that what you will, if they're native or not. And so things like the rock dove are also declining. You can see they were basically non-existent in 1999, down from some pretty high highs of 1,200. And they've seemed to have leveled out a bit, but there was a decline in that overall. So their population declined to about 200 every year, or 400 every count. So maybe this is good news because there is decreasing competition from non-native species. Could also look at the house wren in this example, because house wrens have been known to, though they are native, they have interfered with the nesting success of chickadees and species like bluebirds. They're very aggressive birds, the house wrens, and so that could be interfering with those populations of chickadees or bluebirds. Cavity nesters, essentially. So European starlings and house sparrows, we didn't find any trend. I would have expected a trend with the European starlings as more area in the count circle was converted from agricultural fields to housing development. But as a non-native bird, they're not changing right now, is what our study indicates. And house sparrows seem to be doing much the same. So one of the reasons that I took on this project with Ty, like I was very concerned over chickadees in the area. I would go on bird walks and I'd hear people say, where are all the chickadees? I haven't seen them or heard them lately. It's very quiet out. And so this was one of the main things I was interested in for this study. But thanks to the indices of party hours, effort, weather, all those things, we were able to see that the results are actually more correlated with party hours and effort, time spent in the field looking or observing, than actually a sizable decline in the population. But so that is being said, we have had 2 very low years of chickadees in the last 2 years of the count, 2018 and 2019. This hasn't made enough of an impact that there was a definite trend overall, but I'm interested to see in the next few years whether or not chickadees will have a declining trend, or if they will rebound from the last 2 years and things will even out. In talking with some people in the scientific area, they think that maybe some unusually warm and wet springs may be impaired nesting success. So that's the working theory for those low 2 years. And I was actually very surprised to see that species of concern in Pennsylvania, like eastern bluebirds and wood thrushes, are 2 major species of concern. We found that eastern bluebirds are actually increasing in the count area. There's a very thorough nest box program with monitoring that Audubon is involved with. And this was just so interesting to me because I've been a birder for about 6 years and have been aware of eastern bluebirds' peril in the area, but it's very interesting to see them increase per our model. And the same goes for wood thrushes. I got a little into the reasons for why these things might be happening or why the trends might not be trends. But some factors behind the scenes, of course, have to do with food availability for birds. Every maybe 2 to 7 years, 3 to 7 years, oaks and conifers produce way more food material than usual, than an average year. And this is called a mast year. And so on those years, the overwhelming abundance of food will clearly change a population of birds because of the food availability. And so invasive pest outbreaks as well, they provide more bird food as long as the birds are consuming those species like spruce budworm and emerald ash borer. We saw that interaction potentially with woodpeckers there that Ty talked about. Another reason could be the island effect of habitat destruction elsewhere. So when you have a preserved area in the middle and degraded or damaged habitat in a ring around it or nearby, birds will prefer the island, so to speak, of good habitat, and they'll flock there. And if you count there, then you'll think that birds are doing great. But I think the diversity in the habitat of the count circle would mitigate those results. Again, the timing and counts of migration could be impacting. It's very clear that we only have a very small sample size of 2 days out of the year. So ideally it'd be much more, but you're never going to capture all of the diversity of bird counts when they're migrating or things like that. So one last thing, like I mentioned earlier with the finch conjunctivitis, corvids have been impacted by West Nile virus and malaria, and also avian pox is on the spectrum. It's not necessarily lethal, but it does impact other bird species like robins. And so those bacterial viral outbreaks, they do impact bird populations as well. And they've been interesting. It's interesting to see them interact there. The most obvious reason for bird population change, in my opinion, and ties as well, I'm pretty sure, is the human population in these 3 counties making up the count circle. You don't need to look at the graphs too closely, but it's pretty evident. We've had an overwhelming percentage of people come into these counties over the years. It's almost 300,000 people during the course of this study. So that calls for housing, which is resource consumption, habitat degradation. And so the pollution from the extra vehicles, extra runoff, those things can impact populations as well. And the overall population growth during this period of time in the overall United States was 28%. So it is a big factor for sure. Of course, there are things we can do to mitigate that, like doing what we can to help and advocate for birds. There are quite a few ways of doing that. You can volunteer for your local Christmas and spring bird counts, which is my first thing of choice to do for birds. It is so helpful to have this data. As you can see, it's very useful for us, informing conservation plans, knowing what's going on in a habitat. And if we know what's going on with birds, then we're probably being exposed too. So it's really important to know as the biological indicators of an environment are suffering or not suffering. One thing you can do is do invasive species removal work, do tree plantings, anything to improve habitat for birds. That will help them if they're migrants, if they're not migrants, if they're residents, just across the spectrum. Planting native plants is great for birds, so you should do that, and you should participate in local Christmas and spring bird counts if able. You can use your consumer purchasing power, drink shade-grown organic coffee. Smithsonian Institution has a great brand of coffee that is both of those things and certified bird-friendly. Again, that has to deal with their wintering habitat. Birds winter in the tropics, and that is where a lot of the coffee plantations are. So indirectly applicable for habitat loss there. You can protect migratory birds by treating your windows with stickers or tape, or even UV windows are available. Overall, you can donate to your local Audubon Society to further research like this. And also the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is very on the frontier of doing bird research as well. Also land stewardship, applying less fertilizer, herbicide, pesticide. All you're really doing there is reducing the amount of bugs available for birds to eat. So reducing the size of your lawn, planting native plants, conservation easements, things like that. And I'm always available to advise on native plants. I do that as a profession. So if anyone is looking to do that, I'm happy to help encourage healthier bird habitat. So with that, some final thoughts are that we need more study like this. We need more volunteers to help us collect this data. And especially, I'm really looking forward to the Lights Out Philly initiative. because that is an initiative that just came into play in the last few years in Philadelphia. And when you turn out the lights, it less distracts migratory birds, and this will hopefully reduce losses there with collisions. One thing Ty and I were very happy to notice is that there's been higher participation in the spring bird count every year, or over time at least. And so we're happy to see that. And I think it signals increased care for the natural environment. Yeah, so we're just pleased with that as well. Let's keep it up. And we're also very thankful to all of our mentors who have helped us over the last 2 years to compile all of this research, to go through it, to standardize the data, because it's so variable with so many factors influencing it. And a special thanks to Pat Nastasi of the VFAS for coordinating everything. We're very grateful to Jim Erner and Paul Bernhardt as well for help with statistics. And of course, Macy Turner with the wonderful GIS count circle map, because our previous map was paper with highlighter. So we're very happy to have her. So thank you very much for attending. And we're looking to take questions if people are curious to hear about more.
Thank you, Ty. Thank you, Kelly. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for doing that. And I did forget to mention in the introduction, all of this data came from our volunteers for spring bird counts and Christmas bird counts. And our Christmas bird count is coming up on December the 24th. Yes, I said that right. Christmas Eve is going to be the day of our count. Would love to have as many volunteers as possible. And the second thing is at least, you know, the importance of making sure that the counts are well covered, that all 11 sections are covered, because it makes a big difference in the numbers and in terms of the ability to be able to see these trends. So I just want to, mention that just so that we can thank our volunteers and show you why this is so important, why we do this every year, and it's actually a lot of fun too. So if anybody is interested in helping, I am the compiler for both the spring bird count and the Christmas bird count. So you can send me an email from our website, and I can set you up with a team to help out with the count. With that, let me see. We have 2 questions in the chat. Let me just see what we have here. First question, can you explain the R-square numbers? Does that reflect trends over time? And what R-square would you consider significant?
Yes, I can take that one. The R-squared value is a number that explains the proportion of yearly count variance by the variables that we included in our analysis. So, and then does that reflect trends over time? That's not what we really use to evaluate the results by. That we mainly looked at the p-value for the significance, and the R-square value, that was just to show how strong our model was at explaining the reasons for the fluctuating change in a species count, if that still makes any sense.
Could I jump in as well?
Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it basically tells you your goodness of fit, how, as Ty said, how well your model fits your data. So anything with an R squared above, a 0.4 shows there's a relationship. And as you get closer to 1, it just improves that relationship. So, it's how to put it, there's no hard and fast rule of what a good R squared is. It's, I hate to say it as a scientist, it's, it when you see it. It's, a 0.4 could be very good in a lot of cases. A 0.8 definitely is good, but I've seen cases where 0.2 shows that there's some type of trend there. So.
Thanks for additions there, Jim. Thank you.
Yeah. The other thing, since I was going to type this out, but since I'm in the middle of typing here, I'm going to ask a question. You had mentioned the use of herbicides decrease bird counts. Do we know if that's, or do you guys have a feel if that's a direct effect or an indirect effect where, or I'm sorry, not herbicides, insecticides. Do we know, for example, we know DDT affected the shells of eagles and stuff like that, which was a direct effect. In the case of insecticides, I could see it happening either that's killing off the food source or that it has a direct effect. Do you guys have a feel for that?
Hmm.
I'll take that one. So I was reading the other day, and I think I read that there's 63 million acres of lawn in the United States, which is quite a bit of land, quite a bit of not useful bird habitat. And if you're thinking of the grubs under the earth, I'm thinking it's more of like an indirect effect. But if you're thinking about the grubs or beetles or any arthropod that lives under the earth, then killing and spraying like pesticides that take out those, you're reducing bird food. So, I mean, natural pest control is always better, and birds provide that for sure. Does that help, Jim?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's really, I didn't know if the insecticides themselves were toxic.
Oh, that too. Yeah. When you spray the insects and the insects are still there and the birds still think they can eat them, it does inhibit the breeding success. With cardinals is the example that I looked at there. But yes, it is dangerous.
I have another question here. What types of plants would have the greatest positive effect for birds / bird populations?
So I'll take that one. So you're looking at like oaks and cherries are the most beneficial for like caterpillars and bugs. Those mostly support bird populations, but also high fruiting species like cherries and like elderberries. Sumac has berries too, things like that. Since birds are eating fruit and insects, that's your main concern.
I'm going to jump in on a comment. What I really appreciate that you guys have done is you've taken and solidified some of the trends which I've noticed for the last 20 plus years of birding, and mostly off the top of my head, warbling vireos. I never took the time to be able to crunch the numbers to be able to take a look to see if this is a trend. And I'm not a stat guy, and I just I have in my brain, it's like it feels like I'm starting to see these particular trends in the species, whatever else it might be. And what I really appreciated is that you guys have identified these some of these species and said, yeah, you really are seeing these trends occurring. And I was also fascinated by that the northern mockingbird decline, which that was one of the trends I have noticed for a while in our region. And it seemed like from within certain counts, they were still holding on to their mockingbirds pretty well, while other territories or sections were actually in decline. And it's kind of interesting to see that, you have identified the trend, and it always makes me wonder. It's like when I first started bird watching, it seemed to me the multiflora rows seemed to hold like thick numbers of northern mockingbirds. And in my local area, the multiflora rose is still there, but it seems like it's getting, frequently it gets like a witch's broom, which deforms the fruits and the flowers at the ends. And it seems like once that started to kick in and became a little bit more common, there's all of a sudden this decline in the northern mockingbirds. But it also could be that it's just simply as the scrub layer becomes the next stage of the forest that we lose those mockingbirds. So, but it's just great that you guys are picking out just some of the trends and the woodpecker trends,
For sure.
just to see that, follow through to its end, that it is in the numbers of what we're actually seeing. So I really appreciate that you guys took the time to be able to flush this all out and give us something to kind of project to the next stage, which is collect more data and see where the numbers go. Like you mentioned, the Carolina chickadees. It's like, I'm really curious where we're going to be in the next 10 years with Carolina chickadees and tufted titmouse.
Yes, you hit that on the head. I mean, as far as, these Kelly and Ty did a great job putting this together. But the next step in all of this, and I'll put a plug out there for anybody who wants to do an internship, this is only the first step.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of ways you can get into predictions of what the 10-year trend would be.
Yeah.
And based on what you have now, because you've got, use of Bayesian statistics, you can use the past to predict the future. So, I think if we get an intern who's interested in picking up where they left off, there's a whole lot of stuff they can do. So this is just the first step, and it's a good first step.
Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful job.
Thank you. Yeah, we're very happy to know all this stuff now. I had to also notice these trends, even just in the 6 years that I've been a birder in the Count Circle. Even in 6 years, I was like, wait, where are the mockingbirds?
Yeah.
So it's really nice to see. Well, not nice to see, because
Interesting.
it's
Very interesting.
good to have proof.
Yeah.
Sense.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, because I can have my subjective opinion based on what I'm observing in my little square, but when you guys take this 15-mile radius, and you're right, it's 2 days a year, but with the 30-40 years of data, it starts to show something, and it's just really good stuff. Let's see if anybody else has any questions. Any other questions? Yeah, I thought it was also interesting that you identified the Kestrels, because we've been talking about the decline of American Kestrels in our region for a while, and the data shows that clearly, that especially for our Christmas bird count, that we've had significant declines with our Christmas bird.
I actually have something I'd like to add to that, the Kestrel decline. I'm kind of glad that we didn't have the COVID year in here, because like 2020, when everything shut down, I'm kind of glad we didn't have that, because it would have thrown things off. But I did go for a lot of walks in Valley Forge during that time, and I noticed so many Kestrels. Never before had I seen a Kestrel in Valley Forge Park, which is my front yard. And all of a sudden there were 6 at one time. And so it was very interesting to see, with the removal of humans and dogs from like running in the fields, what was happening there. So I just thought I'd add that tidbit, that it's interesting to me.
Yeah, we did notice that trend with the increase of interest in bird watching during the pandemic, in that bird watching was one of the few activities that people could still do, and they could do it from their backyard. So we noticed there was a huge uptick in the interest in bird watching, which fortunately we were able to take advantage of from our programs committee and everything else, that we really didn't miss a beat and saw more and more people come out, which was just wonderful. I have another question here. I noticed birds at my feeder constantly. Could it be helpful to create an initiative in my local community to install feeders at public locations in an effort to support bird populations?
I'm not so sure that that'd be a great idea. I think the easiest way to support bird populations would be to plant native plants, because it's just more efficient and more long lasting and more diverse food supplement. You're not just getting seed birds, then you're getting birds that eat insects, and even seed birds need, seed-eating birds still need insect protein during their nesting season. So planting native plants is the way to go there. But yeah, if no one else has any questions, then thank you very much, everyone, for coming.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful job. Thanks. And I guess, Kelly, you want me to stay